Hi there. Welcome to the webinar with edWeb and eLuma today. Today, we're really happy to have you here. This is something that's going to resonate with so many of us. Building a practical behavior support framework, going from reactive strategies to more proactive systems. Just a few edWeb webinar tips. If you will post in the chat to join any live discussion, it'll help you if you close any other applications that might take up bandwidth on your device. If you don't like the constant pop-ups, you can disable those from the chat if you just click the checkbox at the top of the chat. If you would like to ask questions, we'll be monitoring those, and you can click the question mark icon. Any audio issues, please refresh your browser, or you could use the phone icon at the top of your screen. And then if you're on a mobile device, please turn off notifications in the Any Meeting Webinars app settings, and that should help you. If you would like to join the edWeb community, it's free. And if you will look at the bottom of this page, you can see the edWeb web addresses in which you can join those communities. I happen to be a member, and it's awesome. I get a lot of good notifications of webinars and materials and so forth. Just a little bit about eLuma today. eLuma's been around for over 15 years now. We're not a response to COVID. We're a virtual services company, but we also provide support and training, coaching, IEP-related services. We dabble a lot in the behavioral health support world to help get systems in place to support students directly. And we also partner with universal screening companies. We're really dedicated to your mission, and we're staffed by a large group of educators who understand your needs. Our real focus this school year is preventing service gaps within your districts. And I would like to introduce Cynthia Kobos. Cynthia is a longtime colleague of mine, and I'll let Cynthia tell you a little bit about herself.
Good morning to the community out there today, whether it's good morning, good afternoon. I see people from New Jersey, Bahamas, Arizona. Welcome today. My little bit about myself. My journey started over 20 years ago in education, background in behavioral health and developmental services, and really helping organizations create meaningful change for individuals and families. I am currently the CEO for Tobosa Developmental Services, where we provide programs from early intervention to adult services for individuals on the DD waiver, focusing on person-centered support. I think that throughout my career, and why I was so passionate to show up today and help Randy talk about behavioral frameworks, is that I've learned that throughout my career, behavior makes sense when we understand the context behind it, as well as that it tells a story. And when adults learn how to really listen to that story, outcomes improve dramatically for children. And the second thing I've learned in reference to behavior plans and interventions for children is that they often work better and sometimes are not necessarily needed when school-wide systems are a priority in schools. And that is why I'm here today to share my experiences with building systems and passion around removing silos and improving continuums of care for schools.
Thank you, Cynthia. And I'm Brandy Samuel. I'm super excited to present with Cynthia. Cynthia is a master in building systems, and I think you guys are really going to take away so much from what she has to share. For me, I'm interested in building systems because, as many of you sitting in the audience today, we don't have the financial resources or the human resources available just to throw additional staff, and we have to build strong systems to most effectively and efficiently support our students. I've been at eLuma 4 years now. I'm the Director of School Solutions. Prior to eLuma, I spent 32 years in public-facing education. I've been super fortunate to serve in rural, suburban, urban and the virtual world prior to COVID and prior to coming to eLuma. I'm super passionate about behavior and spent many of my years in special education, supporting students with significant behavioral needs, and then also have a background in crisis counseling and behavior support. So I love this topic. I love working with you guys to put systems in place that set your kids up for a positive year, and you as well. Okay, we'll get started. So just an overview of what we hope to accomplish and have you leave with today is what you'll leave with. Just a clearer understanding. What is behavior communicating to you? We're not really going to talk about functions of behaviors. We hear that a lot, but just to bring into focus, what is this student telling us? What is this system or lack of telling us? A practical tool for connecting screeners and tiered interventions. And how do we determine what kind of screeners needed? What we really hope to focus on today is a way to resource map with you and build a way to plan for and identify the screeners of what your students might need. So we'll talk about that some. And then we're going to look at a crosswalk, of tiered supports that you can use immediately. I hope you walk away and can put some things in place next week, or at least do a scan with a group of stakeholders, a group of decision makers about what we're doing well, what we could tweak a little bit to make our school year better for all of our students. So what is behavior telling us? You know, I can read this on the screen, and I've heard for years, behavior is communication, not defiance. All of us are aware that behavior serves one of two purposes: to get something or to avoid something. Those are the simple functions of behaviors. We can drill down into all the reasons, but sometimes in schools we try to make it too hard. I had a very esteemed colleague tell me one time, Brenda, you're making this too hard. Behaviors to get or to avoid. So often, if we realize or we're using common formative assessments to identify skill gaps in reading or math, we identify the gaps and we reteach, or we put targeted instruction in place. If a child comes and tells us this thing, I don't know how to do this, we teach them. When a student acts out, it might be the same skill gap. They don't know how to do something. It's expressed differently. What we've traditionally done in the US is we punish or remove students. So I just want to kind of pitch that out there to Cynthia, thinking from a behavioral perspective and a systems perspective, what is this really telling us about what we're doing in a district or what we're not doing, Cynthia?
Yes, I agree. I mean, I think the common focus here is that we shift our understanding that behavior is a form of communication. And as a result of that, we have to shift the way we think and ask the questions, really, instead of saying, how do I stop behavior? How do I help this child? And then that moves us into a problem solving thinking process. And we move away from that punishment procedures and rather think about how do we make meaningful growth rather than repeat the same consequences that aren't working for that child. I'm going to go a step further and say something, Brandy, but also when we look at behavior, it's not just the child. And the focus is looking at the adult's behavior as well, because an unregulated adult cannot regulate an unregulated child. And so we have to understand behavior does not happen in a vacuum, and adults have skill gaps as well. And when we're working on systems, it's also about high quality training for our teachers, as well as helping them be self-aware of their own behavior when they're dealing with behavior on the ground in schools.
I love that. That really resonates. I'm just going to say that again for everybody because it sinks in. An unregulated adult cannot help an unregulated student regulate. A lot of regulation there. And I agree. We see this. Everyone sitting in this room, if we're being honest, we have particular scenarios that come to mind. So thank you for calling that out. Building a system. How do we really build a system? What do systems tell us? What can we learn from them? So what does a reactive system cost? You see, we didn't throw up numbers here because we're all in a little bit different size district or setup, but it costs us discipline. And we see cycles. We see the same students. We see the same out-of-school suspensions. We see the same in-school suspensions. And we tend to see these same students year over year. with the same outcomes. There's lots of us sitting in this room that we have the 1% that we spend 99% of the time on with behavior, or we have the 5% that we spend the 95% of the time on behavior. And what are we doing with the other students, the broader group? And many people sitting here are going to think, oh, those are the students who have significant behavioral disorders. Oh, those are the students with need of special education services. And that's not necessarily always the case. So how do we stop and eliminate these behavioral cycles that we see going on year over year? Another system cost of being reactive, staff burnout. We have staff that deal with much different issues than they did when I started 36 years ago. Much different. We know over time we've always seen crisis after crisis with behavior. We don't necessarily have a system to deal with, or we're not reteaching, or we're not directly teaching a skill. So we put a lot on teachers or any staff, support staff, and we really burn those individuals out. How do we build a system to address that? And how do we teach expected behaviors? I don't think there's anyone in here that would disagree that year over year, we have more and more students come to us with social behavior skill gaps. And then missed instruction. That's a huge cost, because then what do we have? Our school boards, our communities are looking for improved educational outcomes year over year. Well, when we have discipline cycles, we see students out of class, we see missed best first instruction, we see attendance declines, and then we repeat the cycle. We miss that instruction, and then we're seeing more and more students being evaluated for special education services that may or may not need those services if we provided best first instruction with students in the room. So I'm going to keep moving here as we move into systems, but just all things to keep top of mind. Nothing new to any of us, but just top of mind. Why should I build a proactive system to help with my cost? We really advocate for, and when I say we, Cynthia and I, eLuma, any places I've been, we really have promoted resource mapping. And the system that we find most valuable is the SHAPE system. We'll hone in more on it today. However, there are many systems that you can evaluate your resources and where you are. Cynthia is really going to dive into this with some examples. But within this SHAPE system, we look at how are we teaming to support students and staff. We're going to look at needs assessment. What do we have? What do we really have that we're using to support behavior and mental health needs? What are we doing tier one? Every student that walks in our door is a tier one student. It doesn't matter if they have an IEP, a section 504 plan. They're all our students. They walk in our door with tier one, universal needs. Then we're looking at tier two and tier three services within the SHAPE system. What's tier two? What's tier three? Screeners. How do screeners bridge gaps? What kind of impact can we create year over year to improve outcomes both academically and behaviorally and build strong school climates? And then funding. Where are the funding streams? How do we sustain systems? So I'm going to let Cynthia jump in here a bit, and then we'll move into some examples.
Yes, I think that the first thing that to bring a visual to all of the community out there is, if you have a little notepad, I would like you to create 3 circles overlapping. And in one of those circles, I want you to label it systems. And in another circle, I want you to label it data. And then in the third circle would be practices. And on the top of all 3 of those circles, you're going to put outcomes. And what we need to talk about when it comes to systems, no matter what system we are using, 4 elements are what makes systems effective. And you don't have a system if you don't have all 4 of those elements. Because systems that are efficiently, effectively, they support the implementation of practices. Data helps us make decision making, and practices ensure that we're using evidence-based interventions that will give us outcomes for the population that we are working with. And then outcomes are ensuring that we're meeting them? Are they supported and evaluated by data? And so when you look at the categories in the SHAPE system and you look at teaming, teaming is part of systems. Tier 2 and Tier 3 is part of our practices. Funding and sustainability is part of our systems. Needs assessments is part of our data. Screening is part of our data. Tier 1 is part of our practices. And impact, well, that's our outcome. And so when you look at the SHAPE system, it has the 4 main elements of what makes systems effective. And it's really important that a lot of times in education, we want to pick and choose pieces of the system. And then we wonder why things aren't effective. We adopt one intervention. We adopt one best practice or one screening tool. And then we don't know how to address the full continuum of care. And so I want you guys to take that into focus as we understand that a lot of times when working with behavior, if we don't have a full continuum of that system, the framework of the house is built well, we can't add the components that make a system effective.
I agree so much, Cynthia. What resonates with me the most is we tend to pick and choose one or two of the 4 elements, if you will, and then we don't have a comprehensive system. And I use that word intentionally, but I've seen this year over year. I've been guilty of it. I think we all have, everybody in this room, and sometimes it comes down to cost, it comes down to time. But in our next, as Cynthia moves forward and gives us some demonstration, if we could just focus on those 4 things and think about what are we doing that's the one thing, or what are the 3 things? What's that 4th thing that we're missing that could really put a system in place? So as we go through the SHAPE system, here at eLuma, we call it the impact map, but it's the same thing. We've worked with Dr. Hoover out of the National Center for School Mental Health at the University of Maryland. And really within the SHAPE system, we're mapping the resources that are there. We're assessing the quality against national standards, even your state standards, if that's where you need to start. We're reporting. We have summaries of system strengths and needs. Where are we really doing a good job in the district? Where do we really need to improve? And what gap can we meet this year? And then to plan. What's a strategic guidance? How do we close gaps between the resources we have, their effectiveness or ineffectiveness? And how do we make a comprehensive plan that may take more than one school year? It may take more than a semester. So I'll keep moving and I'll let Cynthia speak to that.
Yes.
So
when
we don't get too far. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Brandy. I think that when we look at the SHAPE system, I've used the SHAPE system in the school district when I was a consultant in the schools. And so I'm going to show you some examples of what that looks like and really the pragmatics behind what does that look like at a district level. And I worked at a district level. You can do this at a school building as well. But if you're trying to be strategic and build systems across a school district, I would emphasize having a district-wide team when you are doing impact mapping or a self-assessment of your system. I want to first bring up a guidance tool by the University of Maryland and really highlight the understanding of frameworks. Because I think a lot of times in our field, we are given so many acronyms, so many different interventions, so many different things, and we don't know whether it's an intervention or whether it's a system. And so what I really appreciate about this article from the University of Maryland and the National Center for School Mental Health is they're saying, look, there are many different systems out there that are effective. And it takes self-awareness as a school district to understand when maybe a special education is using one framework and your general education is using another, and how to get on the same page as a school district. And so within this guidance, it does identify 3 best practices frameworks that align with, again, the 4 elements of systems. And so you will see that they identified PBIS, because remember, PBIS is a system. I'm not able to move the page. Do I need to change that somehow? Let's see.
Let me give it a try.
So we're in the system of PBIS. We know that that self-assessment tool is called the tiered fidelity inventory. So I kind of highlighted that. So we understand PBIS is a system, the tiered fidelity inventory, that is our self-assessment tool. Interconnected systems framework is the other framework that is also identified in this article. And let's see, now I am perfect. And their tool is the ISF version 3. And then the third one they do identify as the comprehensive school mental health systems, which is our SHAPE system. And in there is the school mental health quality assessment, or the SMHQA. And I'm going to show you an example of assessment from a district-wide level and give you an example of what that looks like. But I do have this article saved, so you guys have access to it. I encourage you to read it. But what I really want to highlight from this guidance is that in order to be consistent with the direction you're going, understand which system you are identifying with and moving with, so that you don't have this overlap or too many people putting too many different assessments. And then you get so overwhelmed because you don't know which one to use. They are all great. Today, we're going to emphasize the SHAPE system. I've used it. I like the concept. It has good guidance tools. But I know we have a ton of districts out there with us today. So we want to be fair in understanding that you might already have the use of one of these tools. So let me see if I remember how to get out of this one. All right, so now I'm going to go into the questions. I'm not sure if anybody out in the community has ever seen the self-assessment questions from the SHAPE, but again, it's going to go through each of the domains, including the teaming, and this could take a district team. When I first started this with the school district, about 4 hours to complete. And so what you're wanting to do is you're wanting to bring in a team across all of your tiers, whether that's your school counselors, your special education social workers, your psychologists, your community supports that are coming in, your administrators or your teachers or your student assistance teams, anybody that supports the system throughout your school district. You want them to come in and score this together. My team annually at the end of the school district, we would come together. I had somebody that was tech savvy with technology, and she would put the questions up on the screen, and we all had an online scoring tool. And then we would average the score. And that's how we made the district-wide determination. And so we would go question by question, and we would read the best practice description, because oftentimes we think we're doing something. But when you look at the domain and you look at whether, well, do I have, for instance, established communication mechanisms and team meetings? Do we have that? And do we have that across multiple schools? And some other questions might be, do I schedule and hold regular team meetings? Do I clarify roles? You're going to see that this is very similar again to the TFI if you guys are in PBIS districts. But most of all, what you want to get from this is you want to come to a consensus as a district on where you currently are in baseline. Because if you don't have an established baseline, you don't know where to start. And you're going to want to start trying things without good strategic planning and intention around the resources and financial stability that you have to create systems. Systems take time and sometimes years. And so when you look at the entire system in whole, from tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, it takes a team to understand, okay, yeah, we don't have good tier 2, but we should really start in tier 1. And so I think that pragmatically, having a district team come together and score yourself is a good way to have a starting point for strategic planning.
Cynthia, I'm going to jump in and ask you a question before you get much further. So when you talk about bringing in multiple people from the district, do you find that the differences in role plays a large role in the perspectives of how well, say, have communication systems, or how well we're building professional learning communities or whatever. Or the perspectives cause a variance there?
That's a great question, Brandy. Yes, absolutely. So when I first started these self-assessment screeners in our district, I had general education counselors and special education social workers. And when they would read the question domain, especially like, let's say for a tier 1 interventions or tier 2, you could see this clear difference. School counselors would say, yes, we're doing that. And special education social groups would be like, no, we're not doing that. And so because of the silos of the departments, the perspective was different on what they thought was being done. What I like about this particular assessment was the clarity that it brought when it had clear operational definitions of what determined was effective. That common ground brought them both together in scoring. And that's when they started to realize for themselves, we had a lot of work to do. We still had not had good adopted systems in place. And so that was an important piece of learning that, if that answers your question.
Yes. I think we have a couple questions before we move on. Let's see. Nope, I think I was wrong. So I'll let you keep going.
Okay, there was one other I'd like to show the group, and that is going to be the result after you complete a SMHQA. So that is the School Mental Health Quality Progress Report. And in there, you're going to see that it's going to score you on whether you're progressing, emerging, or if you have mastery on any of your teaming, your needs assessment, your funding, your district implementation and support quality, your mental health services. So those are going to be your tier 1, your tier 2, tier 3 services, and early intervention, your impact. So it's going to give you a score. This was a great tool that I would present to our board, to let them know why we were making the decisions we were making, why we were adopting maybe a new ODR system, office discipline referral system, or maybe why we were adopting a new tier 2 intervention, or why we were moving towards a new screener, because our baseline assessment said we didn't have that in place. So this was an excellent tool to drive planning and to map out what we had and did not have. And so I'll just show you a little bit about the report and how it will give you information on your teaming. It'll give you scores on each of your domains. And at the very end of the report, you are also going to see that it'll, let me just see if I can scroll all the way to the end. You're going to give an opportunity to create a strategic plan and talk about what goals that you guys would like to focus on in your district related to an assessment, right? Oftentimes, if we don't know where we're going unless we know where we're starting. And this is an excellent tool for that.
So Cynthia, on this strategic planning guide, just a couple of questions. What have you found to be an effective way to really prioritize, knowing that, as you said, systems take time? We're not going to probably build it in one school year, even if we had all the resources, be it human resources and financial resources. How did you really prioritize when you were leading your district and making change?
Brandy, I had worked in special education for many years as a behavior specialist and worked at tertiary care for intensive behavior interventions plans. And I realized that there was just more and more coming through, right? We were getting more and more behavior plans, more and more children with intensive needs. And so when I shifted over to the general education side, my focus was there's got to be a better way, because our special education system is overloaded and we don't have enough resources and specialized care to be able to write behavior plans for every child. And so when I look at this self-assessment, and when I moved into general education, my priority was to build systems from the first layer up. And so a lot of times, yes, we're trying to build a plane while it's still in the air. And we're still having to work layer 3 systems and tier 3. But building solid tier 1 systems is where I really guided my teams to start. And that was the focus in prioritizing the data from the self-assessment.
I love that. And that really leads us into the next things we're going to focus on. Is how do you look at screeners and more specifically universal screeners, which we see at tier 1. We may not see a screener used school-wide or district-wide, but we're looking at tier 1 for the most part, a set of students. If we're really building a system for this purpose, we're talking about building a system. So if we're thinking about universal screeners, we know in districts we screen for academics on a very regular cadence. Everybody sitting in this room knows this. Common formative assessment has become very typical language within districts. You know, what skill gaps do we have in reading? What skill gaps do we have in math? And how do we reach those? But where we seem to be lacking in the U.S. is universal screening for social behavior, anxiety, stressors, risk, resiliency. We know that through the National Center for School Mental Health that students are 6 times more likely to receive behavioral and or mental health support in schools than the community setting. So I really want to go back to something you said. You know, Cynthia said, well, we took these reports and these self-assessments and we presented them to the board. And what I really want to highlight here is that was data-driven decision making. We talk about this all the time, but how do we use data to drive that social behavior or mental health support that we're putting in schools, and that we're not just shooting at it blindly, because we're using this data to inform our academic instruction every day. But how are we informing our instruction around social behavior? So that's where we really come in. I'll back up a little bit to talk about screeners. And, you know, when you use a screener, there's, again, like Cynthia said around resource mapping, there are many good screeners on the market. The one thing I like to emphasize, are they evidence-based and research-based? And what are they really looking at? Are they looking at the Castle 5, you know, responsible decision-making, communication? Are they looking at risk and resiliency and how to develop pro-social behaviors and how to increase a student's resiliency with those protective factors? Are they looking at the adverse effects of society and stressors? You know, one screener that we endorse and that we work with, just as one example, is the SSIS. SSIS has a component in there that talks about stress factors. You know, this could be huge in a community that's had natural disaster or something. We've also worked with the DESA. It's a great tool as well. DESA really hones in on, you know, the Castle 5. And then there's another litany of screeners out there. But how do we use a screener to really bridge the gap, Cynthia, to put those tier 1 systems in place and get to tiered support?
Absolutely. I think that for me, I'm going to add another layer of component that you just mentioned in reference to making sure we're picking the correct screeners. You have to know what the screeners are screening for and the types of screeners we have. We have screening tools that screen for externalizing behavior, for internalizing behavior, and strengths-based. And so when we look as a district, you taking time to research the tool and determine what tool works best for the concerns you have for your student body are going to help you understand how to ensure you have the correct screener that is going to identify the needs for the interventions that you adopt within your layers of support. Because if you just add in a screener with and it is screening for anxiety, but you don't have interventions for anxiety in tier 2 or tier 3, then you are going to have a lot of data and you're not going to have anything to do. You're not going to have any interventions to guide the child through the system of support or the continuum of support. And so it's really important that you take the time at the beginning when you adopt screeners to make sure it fits your district, it fits your district needs, your children's needs. And sometimes, again, strengths-based screeners, like you were talking about with Castle, when you're looking at self-awareness, self-regulation, goal-oriented behavior, sometimes those are more well-received than those screeners that are looking at externalizing or internalizing behaviors. However, if you do adopt a screener that, Brandy, like a lot of times a screener might bring to you concerns you didn't know you had, like suicide ideation in children, because those are internalizing behaviors. And you might, as school districts, oftentimes we're only focusing on externalizing behaviors. And so screeners do help us identify and catch kids in an attachment that we can move them into interventions that we didn't know they needed.
Right. I love that. So that brings us right into tiered support. So, Cynthia said that when she's led the development of systems, that she really starts with tier one. And we really need to identify, as Cynthia just said, how do we address the things we didn't know were a problem in our district, or we didn't know were a problem within the climate or culture of a particular school? So, tier one, all students. PBIS, positive behavior intervention supports, SEL, social emotional learning, positive climate. We hear that a lot. How do we build that? How do you build the positive climate? What universal identification? What are we identifying? Are we identifying strengths? Are we identifying skill gaps? Are we looking at a way to use a curriculum at tier one? And then consultation, professional development, all things that you can bring in to support with this. Just as we're kind of at the 30-minute mark, tier one, Cynthia, just in a nutshell, in your experience, what have you done that's most impactful to support your district in moving forward, or districts?
Yes, thank you. I really wanted to speak to this one because this is a particular slide I want to. When you look at many of our presentations that we get as educators, you see PBIS in tier one. But remember, PBIS is a system, and so what makes it effective in tier one? Well, that's common language across staff, expectations stated positively, expectations with high visibility across schools, expectations for all our contexts. So recess, hallway, intentional lesson plans for each context area that are taught frequently and are retaught to children that are not demonstrating mastery is also important. But the other one, and the most important, that kind of glues the best practice of PBIS Tier 1 together, is high rates of reinforcement for children who meet the expectations. And then the second caveat I want to add to that, Ms. Brandy, is that people often will ask me, do we need PBIS expectations and SEL curriculum at tier one? And I said, yes. Some people often think it's one or the other. And I always give them this example. I said, I want you to think about, you're in the airport and you can see when you drive up to that airport, you have multiple visual cues, airport parking signs, audio recordings, and repeating things to not leave your bag unattended, right? All of those visual, auditorial expectations that are going on all the time to help people flow efficiently through airports. However, now let's take a time and you're running late and you might miss your flight. And now you need self-awareness and you need to manage your emotions and you need relationship skills and you need optimistic thinking and self-management and social awareness, all to manage the stress that comes with the delay. And guess what? You still need all those expectations at the same time to help you guide you through a stressful situation. So I will also say, when people ask me if high schoolers need expectations in SEL curriculum, I would say yes, because adults still need it, right? And so I think that it's really important that the priority around high quality instruction for behavior and adoption of SEL curriculums in tier one, they work together. And that's what the science is saying. It's not one or the other. And that's my opinion and what I've worked in schools. And so I still think that's a priority in tier one for both of those to be effective.
I agree with you so much. I just think one, in my experience, I have not seen one work well without the other. And it's just, again, it's what supports your system. And, if think about reading and math, we use curriculum reading and math. A district might adopt a systematic way of instruction, but we have a curriculum to support it. So I think it's just really important to call that out.
Yeah.
Tier two, some students, every day I'm on calls with districts. Cynthia and I spent many years in a district together, and I think most people in here would agree. Tier 2 is still confusing. What are we really doing at Tier 2? What are we expecting? What system do we have that supports there? Do we have a curriculum? How do we know what to teach? Especially with behavior. This is where, I kind of get on my soapbox about common formative assessment in reading and math instruction. What assessment? What screening mechanism? What data are we using to support targeted social behavior instruction to meet skill gaps? And I hear every day, Brandy, we shouldn't be teaching these skills. Well, if we want our students to learn, we have to break down and drill down and teach targeted behavioral expectations and skills, because we have many children that come to us that don't have the necessary skills. So what is Tier 2? Some people think it's check in, check out. This came from a survey, actually. Group counseling, targeted skill building. But how do I know what skill to teach if I don't have the data to support that? The screener identifies targeted need for us. This is why we call the screener the bridge. How do we build a system if we don't have the information? And then how do we support counseling, behavioral health systems, opportunities with peers, opportunities with adults? Cynthia, what's been your experience with Tier 2?
Yes, my experience with Tier 2 and improving Tier 2 really relies on being able to map out on paper every intervention a school is offering within Tier 2 and identifying which screener is tied to bridging that child into that intervention. So for instance, check in, check out, you would want to have a clear criteria of how many office discipline referrals are going to warrant a child to start a check-in, check-out program. You're going to talk about what's the entrance criteria, what's the exit criteria, and what is your progress monitoring tool. If you don't have all those components within Tier 2 and ensure that your program that you're adopting, whether that's a curriculum, whether that's counseling, that you understand that in order for it to have outcomes, that you do it with fidelity and that there's a certain outcome that will be tied to it, then you're just kind of just doing the intervention without some control over understanding and knowing when the child has met criteria to exit a Tier 2 or move on to a higher level in the tiered system.
I think that's so important. Do they exit Tier 2? Our goal in education is for all students to be able to be served at Tier 1. But we know that in order to access the appropriate instruction to meet students where they are rather than our expectations, we know that tiered support is necessary. Some more intense, some less intense. So Tier 2 really gives us that opportunity. Do we need to intensify our level of intervention, or can these students has the skill been taught so that the student can access instruction appropriately at Tier 1? And we've got some great questions coming in, and we are going to have time to really address those and hone in. And then Tier 3, individual students. I talk to people all over the U.S. every day, and we have different ways we think about tiers, right? In some states, Tier 3 is an IEP or a Section 504 plan. In other states, not. But just for our purposes, we're just using it as our most intense level. We typically think of Tier 3 as individualized. I like to think it as instruction, support, intervention. These might be our functional behavior assessments, behavior intervention plans, individualized planning. We might have behavior support plans, IEP, individual education plan. Many times the support that comes into these groups are a school psychologist or a BCBA if your district's fortunate to have one, school social workers. Cynthia, what's your one big takeaway for Tier 3 for the group?
I think the big takeaway, I think that functional behavior assessments have been in Tier 3 for many years. I think what districts are starting to see now is direct mental health services moving into those. So for my district, there was that add-on for us to have general education social workers where we were screening individuals who had maybe just come out of residential treatment centers. And we were supporting them in their transition back to schools and providing direct therapy within the school settings off of the SAMHSA grants, if you guys are familiar with that, the Project Aware. So our services within that program also. So not only are you seeing interventions for related to behaviorism, but we're looking also for interventions that are related to mentalism as well. So that internal thinking process, the cognitive behavioral pieces for our general education students. And so we know now in many of the models that we're looking at, especially in New Mexico, general education students can receive Tier 3 services as well. So looking at that, that's my takeaway, is that expansion across services are increasing, and how do we bring in that mental health and behavioral support within one umbrella.
Okay, thank you. So as we move through, we've included a crosswalk for you guys, and you guys can receive all these materials. We really kind of honed on these individually, so just use this as a resource, if you will. And then, as we move forward and we think about today, where does your district have the strongest infrastructure? Where is the biggest gap? What's your strength and your weakness if we think about strengths-based? Using that, where's our greatest strength? Where's our greatest weakness? As you build an action plan, might be on a resource map that you're using, a needs assessment that you're using, what are your state and district priorities? As you build a plan to move forward, what are the priorities that we must meet according to the district? What strengths can we build on? And where's your most urgent gap? Is it a teaming? Do we need to build stronger teams? Is it at screening? Are we using a universal screener? What does Tier 1 look like for us? What does Tier 2 and 3 look like? And then the big one for today, working with a school team, or maybe thinking on your own to take to a team, what is one action that we could do in the district in the next 30 days to start the work toward building a system of tiered support for behavior, social behavior, and mental health? And then we're at the questions section, and we have some good questions. I'm going to read these and kind of throw them out, and Cynthia and I'll tag team them. And the first one is, Cynthia, how can we design a system that responds to individual needs without creating reliance on separating a particular student from the class?
So when I think about it from a systems perspective, I always go back to the data system in place in schools. And so the first thing we want to do is determine how our ODR system is working in our favor to look at that monthly. And so we want to be able to look at office disciplinary referrals from 3 different levels: a building level, a classroom level, and a child level. And so when we're looking at providing interventions to a child in the classroom, we want to see, are there other children still having problem? Is this something where we can reteach the whole class or maybe the whole grade level? And can we address it from a system perspective first? And then secondly, if we can't address it from a system level first, then we add, more resources. Is the child meeting criteria? Is there 5 office disciplinary referrals by September? And do we need to intervene early? And so those office discipline referrals should be what's guiding how to intervene. It should be guiding us to screen that child so that we know how to create a program that aligns with the skills that the screening tool is giving us, and creating a targeted intervention to move the child into Tier 2. And I'm not sure if that answers your question specifically, but a lot of times each school has to build their own programs, and what do they look like? Are they going to be pulled out or pushed in? And that really is developed by the resources you have in the building, and including that your teaming is coming together and being creative, using your librarian, using your custodian, using other parts of your building to help support with interventions.
Yeah, yes, agree. Just to get through a few more questions so we can go in the essence of time. This one I can take. Are there any screening tools that you would recommend for early childhood? The SSIS does go down to age 4. And and you can do multi-raters on there. That would be an age group that you wouldn't do a student rater, but it does have a very impactful section for those early age students, and they've just been renormed. It'll be coming out the SSIS 2. So that's a great question. Here's one, an example, just a real simple example, if you will, Cynthia, of a check-in, check-out protocol. What's a
Yes.
simple one?
There, PBIS, if you go to PBIS website, there is a protocol on there that gives you exactly what the protocol of a check-in, check-out looks like, including when you start sending a letter home to the parent, what data is going to be taken, developing the goal, when are you going to check in, when are you going to check out, what will be taught during the check-in and check-out. So it's very intentional as far as what you're doing in the check-in and check-out. There's also data systems where you can take data on the goals every single day during check-in and check-out. So you're monitoring the goal as you move through this program. And so it's oftentimes you just see the phrase check-in, check-out, and the child comes to the principal's office or teacher's office and, yeah, I checked in. No, it's much more intentional. It's much more instructional. In order for it to be evidence-based at Tier 2. And there's many examples online. I can try to find one and send one in the group at a later time of what that looks like, specifically the protocol.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. And then resources for progress monitoring. In the essence of time, and for this group, it's been my experience with districts that I've consulted with, as well as personally, that screeners, because we use universal screeners beginning, middle, and end of year, we can really progress monitor through that. Many of our screeners, we can progress monitor about every 8 weeks to look at the social behaviors and improvement in skills, as well as attendance, office discipline referrals, and so forth. And I think the next one that we have time for, I'll let Cynthia speak to this one. She has many years of experience with this. Cynthia, what's one tip to get buy-in if working with a parent that's not in agreement that their child has a behavioral issue that could be rooted in the home environment?
I'm going to first say parent connection and relationships. Establishing those early on in the process when you're dealing with a child with behavior. So that's a foundation, right? Because parents are willing to listen to us and receive information when we can listen to them and have a relationship with them. And sometimes that takes time. Sometimes that takes them looking at objective data, looking at the office discipline referrals, making sure you have a solid system that gives you data visualization for a family. When you can pull a report and say, look, I've had 5 instances of a child, hitting a child at recess. It's always during this time. I really think that, doing a check-in, check-out with him right before he goes to recess would be very valuable, and we could probably prevent this behavior from occurring. Would you be willing to try it? The other example would be making sure you have a menu of options in your Tier 2, whether that is not just using your counselor for all your Tier 2 options. So giving them evidence-based opportunities to say, hey, you know what, I also have this particular group that meets in the library with one of our second grade teachers that is teaching SEL. And would you be willing to allow him to go to that? So I think a lot of times it's working and problem solving with parents, and again, foundationally, relationships.
Agree. The relationship and communication. And then think about this as we start wrapping up today. What's one win from the past school year around behavior support that you definitely want to keep in place? And then what's one thing you want to personally do differently in this school year that's right upon us? So just reflect, celebrate, because there's something different we could do every day. And then that's really it. We did have one more question, and I would need a little more info around it. It was really around, how do I get a parent to allow a student participate in Tier 2 interventions without consent? And, that really is going to be based on your district practices. I fortunately have not been in a district where there had to be parent consent for Tier 2, just those targeted interventions. It was something that was identified in skill building, if you will. So I need a little bit more around that. Happy to brainstorm through if you want to put something else in or reach out, but I didn't want anybody to think we had ignored. And then if you would like to win a guided strategic resource mapping session, we'll be offering those, and you can scan this code, and you and I would work together to go through a resource map. I could guide you and a small team, and we would go through your strengths, your weaknesses, and develop a strategic plan. So if you'd like to enter that drawing, you can QR code this. I'll leave it up. I'll give it just a couple more seconds. And then again, back to the edWeb community, it's free. You can see the web addresses below. And again, I can personally attest, I use edWeb a lot, have for a long time. And then we just want to thank you all for attending. I hope it's been an informative session. It's a lot to talk about building systems. I'll let Cynthia give one final word around if you had one piece of advice to build a system to support behavior, social behavior acquisition, what would that be, Cynthia?
Take your time and realize that this is phased out over years. And, you know, again, start with a self-assessment. That was the number one thing that helped us move in a direction of growth.
I agree. Self-assessment and screeners. I really think those are huge. And then I'm going to guide you guys to a poll. If you would do this for us, I'm interested in following eLuma services. We have related service providers. We offer support of the SSIS Universal Screener. We provide implementation and coaching as part of that fee. We staff a lot of general education counselors that provide guidance counseling, SEL instruction, as well as small groups and individual. We do a lot of MTSS consultation and systems building here. We'd love to work with any of you guys. I'll give it a few more seconds. And then again, I just want to thank you all so much for attending. I wish you all the very best school year. I must say that of the years that I've been away from direct school support, I always get a little bit of a heart tug this time of year. I think it's so exciting. And I always say this, but I do believe that education is the most important profession. And I admire what all of you do each and every day. And I appreciate your commitment to kids. Thank you all so much.